The footage is 51 seconds long, and I have watched it, at this point, more times than I've watched anything else in my life. More than movies I love. More than things I've kept for reasons I couldn't explain. I've watched it in my car in parking lots at 2 in the morning, on my phone with the brightness turned all the way down, and once, embarrassingly, on a laptop at a diner, while a waitress refilled my coffee and I minimized the screen like I was hiding something illegal. I wasn't hiding anything illegal. I was hiding something I couldn't explain, which felt worse. The footage shows the interior of my car. The back seat is empty. My voice is on the audio track. You can hear me clearly, asking a question and then pausing, and then saying something in response to what someone said, and then laughing quietly at something, and then going quiet for a long stretch, and at the end saying, "Take care of yourself," the way I always say it, the specific way I've said it for years, with a kind of weight that I can't seem to flatten out no matter how many times I try. All of that is on the audio. My voice, a conversation, a pause, a small laugh, and those 4 words. The back seat is empty. Has been empty, according to the camera, for the entire 51 seconds of the clip. I'm going to try to explain how I got there, how I got to the point of watching that footage in a parking lot at 2 in the morning, but I want to say something first, because I think it matters for how you understand everything that comes after. I'm not a superstitious person. I'm not someone who believes in things without evidence. I spent 7 years working in crisis intervention, which is a field that does not leave a lot of room for the metaphysical. You work in that field long enough and you develop a very specific relationship with the idea of the unexplainable. You stop finding it romantic. You find it exhausting, and then, eventually, you stop finding it at all, because what you're left with at the end of every shift is not mystery, but paperwork. And the paperwork is about real people and real situations. And none of it has anything to do with the supernatural. It has to do with the ordinary catastrophe of being human. And that catastrophe is entirely sufficient. I left that field about 14 months before all of this started. I'm not going to go into the specifics of why. Not because I'm being evasive, but because the specifics aren't the point, and because I'm still working through the specifics myself, and I've learned that some things process better when you don't keep narrating them. What I'll say is that I left, and I needed something to do that wasn't that, and driving at night seemed like the right opposite. Quiet. Contained. The only decisions that mattered were small ones. Which lane? Which route? Whether to take the bridge or go around. I could be helpful in a way that had a clear beginning and end. I could be with people without being responsible for them. I thought that was what I needed. I drove nights mostly, 10 p.m. to 4 or 5 in the morning, sometimes later if the rides kept coming in. I learned the city the way you can only learn it on the night shift, which is to say I learned its real geography. Not where things were, but what they were at 3 a.m., which is a completely different city from the one that exists in daylight. The bar districts emptying out around 2, the hospital pickups at odd hours, the airport runs that started well before dawn, the occasional person just walking somewhere because they couldn't sleep, flagging a ride to nowhere in particular. Night driving draws a specific cross-section of people, and I became, without meaning to, a student of that cross-section. I had the habit of attention. I've been trained into it. I couldn't turn it off. Most rides were unremarkable. Most people were tired or drunk or distracted, or all 3. They told me about their days, or they didn't talk at all, or they were on their phones the entire time. I learned not to take the silence personally. I learned not to perform friendliness in a way that felt false. I settled into a specific register, present but not intrusive, available but not needy, that I think worked pretty well for the job. My rating stayed high. I got the occasional note and a comment about being easy to ride with, which was the closest to a professional compliment I'd received in some time, and which I appreciated more than I probably should have. The camera, I should explain the camera, I had a dual-channel Dashcam, front-facing and interior-facing that I'd mounted when I started. A lot of drivers have them. They're partly for safety and partly because the app requires them in some markets, and partly, I think, for most people, just because the camera makes the car feel less like a place where something could go wrong without record. That's the honest reason. You put a camera in the car because you're not alone in there. Not entirely. Because there's always a witness. It records continuously while the car is running, overwrites old footage in a loop every 72 hours. Unless something triggers the emergency save function. I'd reviewed footage maybe a dozen times in the first year, mostly when a passenger disputed a route or when I had a fender bender on the bridge. It did what cameras do. It confirmed things. I want to tell you about a woman I'll call Dana. I don't know her real name. The app shows first names only, And Dana is the name I have in my head when I think about her, even though her name might have been something completely different. I picked her up on a Thursday night, or Friday morning technically, around 1:40 a.m., from a bar in the Fillmore district, one of the quieter ones, a place with good lighting, and not the kind of crowd that makes you nervous. She was waiting on the sidewalk when I pulled up, not leaning on the building the way people usually do when they're drunk and waiting, just standing very straight and very still with her hands at her sides and a small bag over one shoulder. She was maybe 35. She was wearing a gray coat that was too light for how cold it was. She looked at my car for a moment before getting in, the way someone might look at a door they're deciding whether to open. She got in and she told me the address, not through the app, which is unusual. She just said it out loud. A neighborhood on the east side, residential, and I confirmed it and started driving. She was quiet, not the quiet of someone tired or on their phone, the quiet of someone who was very much present and very much not interested in being interrupted. I noticed it the way I notice things, the way I'd trained myself to notice things, and I made a decision not to talk unless she wanted to. About 10 minutes in, she said, without preamble, "Do you ever think about how much of your life you spend in places you're just passing through?" It was late. I'd been driving for 4 hours. The question landed differently than it might have in daylight. I said something like, "Yeah, actually, I think about that a lot," which was true. She was quiet again for a minute, and then she said, "I think that's most of it. Most of your life. You're just passing through something to get somewhere else, and you spend so much time thinking about the somewhere else that you forget to, I don't know, notice where you are." I agreed with her. It was a kind of thing you say at 1:40 a.m. when you're driving through a city that's mostly asleep and someone in your back seat says something true. She went quiet after that, and we drove the rest of the way without talking. And I dropped her off at a brownstone on a street lined with trees that had gone bare for winter. And she got out and she said thank you, and walked toward the building without looking back. That was the whole ride. I thought about it a little on the drive home because the question had stuck with me, the passing through thing, but I didn't think about her specifically, not in any particular way. She was a person. She'd said something interesting. She'd gone home. 3 weeks later, I was sitting in my car at a gas station at about 7 in the morning, after a long shift, half asleep, scrolling through my phone the way you do when you're too tired to drive but not ready to stop being somewhere. I came across a small item in the local paper's online section. A brief piece, the kind that runs in the second tier of local news, the kind that doesn't get picked up nationally. It was about a woman, 34 years old, who'd been found at a park near the Eastern Reservoir. The article was vague in the way those articles are when the story isn't accidental and hasn't been confirmed yet, and there was no photograph, and the name wasn't given because the family hadn't yet been notified or had requested privacy or one of those things, and I have no way of knowing, no way at all, whether it was her. I'm telling you this because I need you to understand that what started it wasn't certainty. What started it was the fact that I couldn't stop thinking about the gray coat and the way she'd been standing on the sidewalk, not leaning, just standing, and the question she'd asked, and the way she'd thanked me and walked toward the building without looking back. And I knew, from the work I used to do, from 7 years of it, that the way people carry things isn't always visible, that the hardest cases were often the ones who seem most contained, that there was a quality to those cases, something in how they held themselves, something I had been trained to notice, and that I had in fact noticed, and had not acted on because there was nothing to act on. She was going home. She said thank you. She walked toward the building. I went back to the footage from that night. I watched the pickup, the drive, the drop-off. She was there, clearly, her gray coat, her still posture, her face turned slightly away from the camera the whole ride, which I hadn't noticed in the moment, but which, in the footage, looked deliberate in a way I couldn't articulate. She was there. The camera saw her. I felt something loosen slightly in my chest, the specific feeling of a tension you didn't know you were holding until it releases. She was on camera. She had been real and visible and recorded. Whatever I thought I'd noticed, whatever the trained part of my brain had flagged, it didn't mean what I'd been afraid it meant. Except I still couldn't get the gray coat out of my head, and I still don't know if it was her in the article. I need to tell you about those 7 years before I go further, because they matter. I worked for a nonprofit crisis service, not a hotline though, we interfaced with the hotline, but a mobile unit. We went places. We met people in the specific geography of their worst moments. Parking lots, emergency rooms, apartment hallways, parks, One time, a public library, when a call had come in about a man in the periodical section who hadn't moved in 4 hours, and who turned out to be in a state that I still don't have good language for, a state that was beyond panic and beyond despair. That was something quieter and more final than either of those words suggest. We had training. We had protocols. But the protocols were a frame, not the work. The work was about reading people, about learning to see the thing that was happening beneath the thing that was presenting, about recognizing, before the conversation had gotten far enough to confirm it, that a person had moved into a particular territory. My supervisor, a woman who'd been doing this work for 23 years, and who had a quality of stillness that I have never encountered in anyone else before or since, used to say that the most dangerous assumption in the field was that danger looked dangerous. She said that the cases you missed were always the ones that looked like something else. They looked like tiredness. They looked like someone who was fine and just needed a little time. She called it the remove, the specific quality of someone who had, in some interior room of themselves, already gone somewhere else. You couldn't always see it, but you could learn to feel it, in the way a room feels different when the temperature has dropped 2 degrees. Not cold, not yet, but something has changed and your body registers it before your mind does. I was good at feeling it, better than I was at almost anything else in the work. And when I left, I thought I'd left it behind. The sensitivity, the attunement, all of it. But you can't actually leave a trained perception. It doesn't work that way. The part of your brain that was shaped by 7 years of that specific attention doesn't go dormant because you change jobs. It keeps scanning. It keeps noticing. It just has nowhere to go. The second person I want to tell you about, I'll call him Marcus, I picked up about 6 weeks after Dana. I was working a Friday night, coming up on midnight, and the app sent me to a pickup outside a hotel, downtown. One of the mid-range business hotels that were always full of people passing through for conferences or medical appointments or whatever the anonymous business of hotel rooms entails. He was waiting under the awning. Late 40s, maybe early 50s, a wheeled bag, dressed like someone who'd been in a meeting all day and hadn't changed. The destination he put in was the bus terminal, which surprised me. The bus terminal was a good 40 minutes away, and it was nearly midnight. And the bus terminal at midnight is not a comfortable place unless you're going somewhere specific at a specific time. I asked if he had a bus to catch, and he said yes, a late one, southbound. I asked where south, and he said he'd figure it out when he got there, and I didn't push it because it wasn't my place. We drove for a while in silence, and then he asked me, out of nowhere, how long I'd been driving. I said about a year. He asked what I'd done before. I said I'd worked in social services, which is the way I'd learned to describe it. General enough to be true, specific enough to be deflecting. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "That's hard work." I said it was. He said, "My brother did something like that, worked at a VA, counseling." He said the hardest part was knowing when you couldn't help someone, not the ones who were in crisis, the ones who were past it. I kept my eyes on the road. I said, "Yeah, that sounds about right." He said he kept taking it home. He paused. I don't think he ever really stopped taking it home. I said I understood that. He didn't say anything else for the rest of the ride, which was another 25 minutes. I could see him in the rearview mirror occasionally. He was looking out the window at the city going by, the interstate, the bridge, the industrial stretch that preceded the terminal. He looked like someone watching something for the last time, which is an impression you can form and be completely wrong about. People look like that when they're tired. People look like that when they've had a long week. I talked myself out of the impression twice before I pulled into the terminal drop-off. Before he got out, he said, "Can I give you some cash?" And I said the app handles payment, and he said, yeah, he knows, but he'd like to. And he gave me a 20 and looked at me for a moment in a way that was direct and considered, and then said thank you, and got out with his rolling bag and walked toward the terminal entrance, without hurrying, the way people walk when they have time or when they're not sure where they're going next. I sat in the drop-off lane for longer than I should have. There was a line of cars behind me, and eventually someone honked and I pulled out. I drove 2 blocks and then I pulled over on a side street and I sat there for a while with the car running and the heater on, and I thought about calling the non-emergency line. To say what? A man at the bus terminal seemed tired, was looking at the city like it was his last time, had given me cash and thanked me in a specific way. There was nothing to say. There was a feeling, and a $20 bill on the passenger seat, and the sound of the city. And that was it. I drove away. I thought about him for weeks. I still think about him. I have no way of knowing what happened to Marcus. I have no reason to believe anything bad happened. People leave cities all the time. People take late buses south. People tip their drivers in cash and say thank you in specific ways, and it means nothing except that they're having a human moment in the back of a stranger's car, which happens constantly, which was one of the things I had genuinely come to love about this job. Those small human moments that meant everything and nothing at once. I have no reason to believe Marcus was anything other than a tired businessman heading somewhere else. But I watched the footage from that ride 3 or 4 times over the following week, not looking for anything, just watching. He was visible, clearly visible, his face, his bag, his eyes going to the window. Present. Recorded. The camera had him. I watched his face on the small screen and tried to read what I'd been reading in the car, the impression I'd formed, and I couldn't quite reconstruct it. On camera, he just looked like a man, a little tired, going somewhere. I don't know whether to trust the camera or trust the memory. That started to be the question. There's something that happens on the night shift, I don't know quite how to describe it, that doesn't happen when you work days. Something about sustained exposure to the hours after midnight, to the particular quality of attention that those hours require, to the specific kind of conversation that happens in a car in the dark, when the city is quieted down and the ordinary social defenses are down, and people say things they wouldn't say at noon. After about 8 months of it, I noticed that I was carrying less armor in general. Not in a bad way, not in a broken way, but in the way that a callus you've developed can, under certain conditions, soften. I'd spent years building a professional distance. Not coldness, but a buffer, a necessary insulation. And the night driving was slowly and without my permission, eroding it. I noticed things more sharply. I felt things faster. Passengers who were sad felt sad to me in a way that was almost physical. The way a temperature change registers. Passengers who were frightened, or lonely, or at the end of something. I felt those states before they said anything that confirmed them. I told myself this was just the old sensitivity reactivating, the perceptive muscle, remembering its training. Nothing more than that. I didn't connect it to anything else. Not then. The third person I want to tell you about is the one the footage can't explain. She didn't have a name in the app, or rather, the name the app showed me was Nadia, but I've never been able to find anything about the ride afterward, which I'll explain in a moment. And Nadia feels like a name I might have invented, though I know I didn't. You don't invent details at 3:30 in the morning when you're running on 2 hours of sleep and a cup of coffee that had been in the holder so long it was barely warm. You're not in a state of imagination. You're in a state of bare attention. The request came in at 3:27 a.m. on a Tuesday, or I suppose technically Wednesday. I'd been about to log off. I had 4 hours before I had to be somewhere, and 4 hours is just enough sleep to function on if you don't think too hard about what functioning actually requires. But the request was close, maybe 6 blocks, and I accepted it before I thought about it. Habit, you accept the close ones. The pickup was on a street I knew, a block of apartment buildings interrupted by a laundromat, and a closed Vietnamese restaurant whose sign was still lit, just the red glow of the sign and nothing else. She was standing in front of the laundromat, not waiting for the laundromat. It was closed, dark inside except for the glow of machines that ran overnight, just standing in front of it in a pale jacket, and she looked up when I pulled to the curb and walked to the car without hesitating, and got in, and she said the address, a neighborhood about 25 minutes north, and I confirmed it and pulled out. I felt it immediately, not gradually the way it had come with Dana and Marcus, but immediately the way you sometimes know something before you can name it. I want to be careful about how I say this because I don't want it to sound theatrical or constructed. It wasn't a chill. It wasn't a premonition. It was more like a depth change, the way the water feels different when you swim into a cold current. Still water, still familiar, but something in the quality of it is entirely altered. She was in my back seat, and something about the air in the car was different. She was quiet. I didn't initiate conversation. I drove north through nearly empty streets, through a residential stretch where even the dogs had stopped barking, through the last lit intersection before the neighborhood thinned out into smaller houses and longer gaps between streetlights. The city got quieter around us as we went. There's a specific quality to those northern neighborhoods at 3:30 a.m. that I've never been able to fully articulate. Not eerie, not abandoned, just deeply at rest, in a way that feels both peaceful and slightly wrong if you're awake inside it. About 12 minutes into the drive, she said, "You don't talk much." I said I tried to follow the passenger's lead. She said, "That's considerate." We drove for another few minutes. Then she said, Not like a question, more like a statement she was testing. You used to do something else. I said, yes. She said, something where you had to pay close attention to people. I said that was a good way to put it. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, can I ask you something? And you don't have to answer if it's weird. I said, sure. She said, do you ever feel like you can tell, just from being near someone, whether they're okay? Not whether they seem okay, whether they actually are. I drove through an intersection. The light was green. I didn't answer right away. I said, sometimes I try not to rely on it too much. She said, why not? I said, because perception is interpretive. Because you can be wrong. Because acting on something you're not sure of can cause its own damage. She said, but when you're right, you're right. I said, yes, I suppose so. She said, I think that's a kind of thing worth keeping, even if it's uncomfortable. We pulled up to the address, a small house set back from the road, a light on in one window, the rest dark. She thanked me and got out and walked to the front door, and I waited until I saw her go inside, which I've started doing, waiting until I see them go inside, and then I drove away. I didn't think about reviewing the footage that night. I was tired, and the drive home was automatic. One of those drives where you arrive and you're not entirely sure how you got there. I ate something, I don't remember what, and I fell asleep in the chair rather than the bed, which happens when I've been out too long. 2 days later, I was cleaning out the car. I do it every few days, it accumulates fast. Coffee cups and receipts and the general detritus of a car that's running 12 hours a day. And I found a piece of paper on the back seat. Not a receipt, not a flyer, a folded square of paper from what appeared to be a small notebook, the kind with the spiral binding torn along the edge. It had nothing on it. It was blank, but it had been folded deliberately, in that specific square fold, and it had been left on the seat, and it had not been there before Nadia. I went back through 2 days of rides mentally. There had been no one else in the back seat since her, and I stood there in the parking lot in the late afternoon light, holding this piece of blank paper for what was probably a full minute before I set it on the dashboard, and went back to cleaning. That evening I thought about it, and couldn't stop thinking about it, and I'm not sure exactly why it was the piece of blank paper and not the conversation or the quality of the air in the car that made me go back and look at the footage, but it was. I opened the app on my laptop. They keep a record of completed rides for 60 days, and I found the ride, Tuesday night, 3:27 a.m., destination a residential address in the northern neighborhood. Payment processed, completed. The ride existed. I pulled up the camera footage. The Dashcam saves clips by trip, triggered by the app's start and end, so I had the specific clip. I opened it. The front seat, my hands on the wheel, the empty road ahead, the nighttime streets I remembered, the green light at the intersection, the back seat, empty. I scrolled back to the beginning of the clip. Empty from the start. I fast-forwarded through the entire 25 minutes. Empty throughout. My hands on the wheel, my face occasionally visible in the rearview mirror. I could see myself glancing up a few times, the small involuntary check you do when someone's in the back looking at where they would be, and then back to the road. But the back seat was empty. No figure, no coat, no shape at all, and my voice on the audio clearly saying, I try not to rely on it too much. I listened to the whole 51 seconds of conversation. I hadn't realized it was only 51 seconds, it had felt longer. And my voice was there throughout it. Every response, every pause, the specific cadence of a conversation I remembered having. And the back seat was empty, and the space where her voice came from was just the car's interior audio catching whatever acoustic echo my voice made in that direction. I closed the laptop. I sat in my kitchen for a long time. The first thing I did, the very first thing, the instinct that came before anything else, was to open the app on my phone and look at the ride record again. It was there, completed. Nadia. Payment processed. I'd been paid for the ride. There was no rating left, which happens sometimes, and there was no note. But the ride had happened. The app confirmed it, the camera did not. I'm going to try to walk through what I thought in the hours after, because I think the sequence matters and because I want to be precise about what I did and didn't conclude. I thought, camera malfunction. Obviously. First, most reasonable explanation. The interior camera had failed to record. The audio had continued, the footage had captured nothing but dark space where a person had been sitting. This happens. It had never happened before. In 14 months. But it could happen. The camera was a consumer device, not industrial equipment. It had a sensor. Sensors fail. But, and this is where I got stuck, if the camera had malfunctioned, why was the audio intact? The Dashcam records audio and video on the same device? The same file? A sensor failure that blanked the video should have affected the whole recording. What I was looking at was a complete video that happened to show an empty back seat, with clean audio of a conversation that clearly involved two people. I thought, she was sitting at an angle the camera couldn't capture. I pulled up the footage again and looked at the camera angle. The interior-facing lens mounted on the rearview mirror, angled back to cover the rear seat. I'd mounted it myself when I started driving. I knew the angle. It covered the entire back seat. I had other footage from that same camera, from that same night, earlier rides, and in every one of them passengers were fully visible. A couple leaving a concert, a teenager who'd gotten separated from her friends, a man in a construction jacket who'd slept the whole ride. All there, all captured. I thought she was sitting at an unusual angle, leaning far forward maybe, below the camera's field, but I remembered her. I remembered her in the rearview mirror. I'd glanced up at those moments in the footage. I'd seen myself glancing up, which meant there had been something there to look at. My eyes going to the place in the mirror where a backseat passenger would be, my head making that small accommodation that happens when someone's behind you. My body had known she was there. I thought, what if I had this wrong about the other cases? I went back to the Dana footage. She was there visibly, coat and all, face turned slightly away. I went back to the Marcus footage. Clearly there. The specific way he sat, leaning back looking out the window. Both of them captured. Normal. Visible. Just Nadia. Just that ride. I sat with a blank piece of paper on the table in front of me. She had folded it deliberately. Left it there. I thought about why you would fold a blank piece of paper and leave it in a car. I thought about whether you would do that without being aware of doing it, the way people leave things without meaning to. I thought about the conversation. Do you ever feel like you can tell whether they're actually okay? And what it meant that she had asked me that, what she had been asking me to confirm? I thought about the fact that I had said yes sometimes and had meant it. I thought about the blank paper for a long time. About what you leave behind when you leave. About what constitutes a record. About the difference between what is captured and what is real. I called a person I knew, someone I'd worked with years ago, a colleague from the mobile unit days, a man named Theo who had stayed in the field when I'd left it, who had the particular unshockability of someone who has metabolized too much to be surprised by any single thing anymore. I told him what had happened. Not all of it. I left out the Dana and Marcus context because I wasn't sure I could explain the connection without sounding like I'd constructed one. But I told him about the ride, the conversation, the footage. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Okay, when people are in extreme states, when they've made a decision, or are very close to making one, there's sometimes a quality to the interaction that's hard to categorize. You used to feel that. You know what I'm talking about?" I said yes. He said, "The thing about that quality is that it's not always visible. It doesn't necessarily show up in behavior. It shows up in the interaction, in what it feels like to be in the room with someone. You trained yourself for years to feel it, and you felt it." I said yes. "But the camera," he said, "the camera records light. That's all it does. It's very good at that one thing." He said it the way my old supervisor would have said it, not dismissively, not as a deflection, but as a precise distinction. The camera records light. It doesn't record what you feel in your body when you sit across from someone who has moved into the remove. Those are two different kinds of information. I said that was true, but the footage still showed an empty seat. There was still a person not on the video. He was quiet again. Then he said, "Maybe check the camera. Maybe it malfunctioned." That's the most sensible answer. I said I knew. I said I'd probably do that. He said, "And Marcus and the woman with the gray coat? How long ago were those?" I said 6 weeks and 3 months approximately. He said nothing for a second. Then, "You haven't heard anything bad about either of them?" I said no. I said I had no way of knowing. He said, "No, you don't." He paused. "But you felt it, right? You felt the thing." I said yes. He said, "That's what I think about, not the camera. What I don't know is where she is now. I have tried in the low-grade way of someone who knows they don't have much to go on, to find out. The address I dropped her off at, a small house with a light in one window, I drove by it 3 times in the 2 weeks after. Once in daylight, once at night, once at a specific time that felt, for reasons I can't explain, significant. A woman came to the door of the house the second time, a different woman, older, and looked at my car without recognition and went back inside. I don't know if Nadia lived there or was visiting someone there or had given me a false address, which would explain some things and not others. I thought about her question. Do you ever feel like you can tell whether they're actually okay? And what it meant that she had been asking someone in a car at 3:27 a.m. on a Tuesday, someone she had identified correctly as having a trained sensitivity to that exact thing. What are you doing? Sitting in the back seat of a stranger's car at that hour, asking that question. You're checking something. You're running a test. You're confirming something you already know and needed to hear confirmed. She had confirmed it. I had told her yes. I had told her I tried not to rely on it too much. Because perception is interpretive. Because you can be wrong. Because acting on something uncertain can cause its own damage. And she had said, but when you're right, you're right. I've thought about whether that conversation was her asking for something. Whether the blank paper was a kind of message. Not a message with content, because there was no content. But a message in the fact of its deliberate folding. Its careful leaving. Its existence as an object in a space after she was gone from it. Whether she was saying, you saw me? I was here. Here is evidence. The blank paper is evidence of nothing except that someone was there and folded it and left it. Which is either everything or nothing depending on what you're trying to prove. I kept it. It's in the glove compartment. I'm not sure why I kept it, except that throwing it away felt wrong in a way I couldn't rationalize. And I've stopped trying to rationalize everything. That particular effort, the effort of rationalizing everything, of needing every impression to resolve into a verified fact, was part of what broke me in the work I used to do. You spend years in a field where the stakes are very high and the evidence is often very thin. And at some point you have to decide, do I trust what I'm seeing and be wrong sometimes? Or do I demand verification and miss the things that verification can't catch? I chose verification for a long time. I was very rigorous. I was very careful. And then something happened that I'm not going to describe in full. A case I won't detail, a person I thought I had correctly read as stable and who was not stable. And the aftermath of that, not the legal aftermath, not the professional aftermath, but the interior aftermath, was what ended that chapter. I don't drive nights anymore because I'm healed from that. I drive nights because the work is there, and I need the money, and because the night, it turns out, is where I still feel most like myself, which might be the saddest sentence I've said in this whole account, and might also be the most honest one. About 2 months after Nadia, on a night I hadn't planned to work, I logged on at around 11 p.m. because I couldn't sleep and being stationary in my apartment was worse than moving. The city was quiet for a weeknight, the kinds of rides you get when nothing is happening, people getting home from late dinners, a couple who'd had a fight and been separated into 2 Ubers heading to 2 different places without discussing it, a college kid who'd missed the last bus. Normal rides. Unremarkable. The kind of night that accumulates and disappears. At 2:15, I picked up a man outside a pharmacy on the north end of downtown. He was maybe 60, wearing a jacket that was too thin for the weather, the kind of outfit that suggests someone had not planned to be outside, had not expected the cold. The destination was a hospital, not the emergency entrance, the regular entrance, the one that takes people who have appointments at hours that aren't technically appointment hours. He got in and he smelled of coffee and something older and he said the address and I drove toward it. He didn't say anything for several minutes. I didn't either. The roads were empty in the specific way they get after 2 a.m. when even the bars have closed, and the city is down to its skeleton crew of night workers and insomniacs and the occasional car whose driver has nowhere particular to be. He said at some point in the middle of it, "My sister." I didn't respond immediately. I understood what he meant. The hospital, his sister, she was there, he was going there. And I said something simple, acknowledging it. He said, "She's not going to make it. I've known for 2 weeks and I keep coming up with reasons not to go." I said, "Tonight?" He said, "Tonight I ran out of reasons." We drove. The hospital came into view a few blocks ahead, the lit entrance, the sign. I pulled up to the curb. He sat for a moment without moving. I said, "Take care of yourself." He looked at me in the rearview mirror. He said, "That's a funny thing to say." I said I meant it. He said, "I know. That's why it's funny." He got out. I drove away. I didn't feel the remove from him. I felt grief, the specific gravity of it, real and unmistakable, but grief is not the remove. Grief is still fully present, fully alive. Grief is the most present you can be sometimes. He was in pain and he was going toward it and he had a reason to keep moving, which is not nothing, which is actually quite a lot. I didn't review the footage from that ride. I thought about it briefly, and then I drove home and I went to bed and I slept for 6 hours, which was more than I usually managed. And when I woke up, the apartment was bright and ordinary, and the piece of blank paper was in the glove compartment of the car parked outside, and the 51-second clip was backed up to the cloud, and all of it was exactly as it had been. And I lay there in the ordinary, morning light, and thought about the man running out of reasons not to go, and finally going, and I felt something that was not quite relief and not quite sadness, but something adjacent to both. A kind of ache that wasn't painful, more like a bruise you press to confirm it's still there. I want to say something about the remove before I finish, about what it is and what I think it is, because I've spent a lot of time trying to understand what I was perceiving in those specific people. Dana, maybe, Marcus, maybe, and Nadia, certainly, in the car at 3:27 in the morning, and whether what I was perceiving was real or whether I was projecting, imposing a pattern from my old work onto people who were just tired, or just private, or just inhabiting a late-night mood that I was misreading. My old supervisor used to say the remove was not a diagnosis and not a verdict. She said it was a state of interior distance, a place a person could be in and still come back from. If something changed, if the temperature changed, as she put it, if something warm reached them. She said the thing about people in the remove was not that they were operating in a register where ordinary communication didn't reach, not because they couldn't hear it, but because they had temporarily moved beyond the frequency where it mattered. And what could sometimes change things, not always, not reliably, not as a method, was someone recognizing the remove without flinching from it, not trying to talk them out of it, not deploying a protocol, not reaching for a script, just being in the space with them and letting them know they'd been seen. That's what Nadia was asking about, that specific thing. And what I've been wondering since I watched that footage, is whether the remove at a certain depth is something a camera can actually fail to see, not because the person is supernatural, not because there's anything metaphysical happening, but because the camera records light reflecting off surfaces, and maybe there is a depth of interior distance at which the surface the camera is reading has become so thin, so translucent, that the image simply doesn't register the way it should. A person so far into the remove that even the recording device encounters something it can't quite fix to the screen. I don't know if that's true. I'm not a scientist. I'm a person who used to do crisis work and now drives people around at night, and has, on exactly one recorded occasion, apparently had a 25-minute conversation with an empty back seat. What I know is that she was there. I know because my body knew it, and because there is a piece of blank paper folded in a specific deliberate way sitting in my glove compartment, and because I drove the route and I said take care of yourself at the end and I meant it, and because for the entire ride I felt the remove coming off her in waves, and I did not reach for a protocol or a script. I just drove and talked and tried to stay in the frequency where it might matter, which was the only thing I knew how to do. I still drive. I haven't stopped. I log on most nights around 10, and I drive until the rides stop coming in, or until I'm too tired to be safe. Whichever comes first. I still feel the thing sometimes. The remove, the depth change, the specific quality of the air, and when I feel it, I don't try to diagnose it or document it or work backward from it to a conclusion. I just pay attention. I just stay present, I say, take care of yourself at the end of every ride, regardless. And sometimes I mean it with more weight than other times. And the people it's meant for most heavily don't always know that. Which is fine. They don't need to know. I stopped reviewing footage regularly. The camera is still there, still running, because that's policy and because the practical reasons for having it haven't changed. But I don't go back and watch rides the way I was doing. I made a decision to trust the other record, the interior one, the one that isn't on any card or cloud, the one that accumulates in you when you spend years paying attention to people in their worst moments, and then years more sitting with them in the dark of a car and feeling what they're carrying. That record is imperfect. It is absolutely interpretive. It can be wrong, and has been wrong, and will be wrong again. But it's the only instrument I have that records what the camera can't. There's one more thing and then I'm done. About a month ago, 2:40 in the morning, a woman got in at a 24-hour drugstore on the east side. She was maybe 26, 27. Hoodie, no makeup. The kind of face you see when someone has been holding something in for a long time and is very close to putting it down. The destination she'd entered was a park, which is unusual. A park at 2:40 a.m., not a park near a residence, but a park by itself as a destination, which sent something up the back of my spine in a way I recognized. I drove toward the park. About halfway there, without planning to, I said, "Long night?" She said quietly, "Yeah." I drove another block. Then I said, I used to work with people, before this, in crisis services. It's probably nothing, but sometimes when I'm driving late, I get the sense of when someone's having more than just a long night, and I want to ask if you're okay. Not being weird. Just something in me wants to check. There was a silence that was long enough that I thought I'd gotten it wrong. Thought I was going to have to apologize and drive the rest of the way in the specific awful quiet of a misread. Then she said, "That's the first time anyone's asked me that in I don't know how long." We didn't go to the park. I drove instead, with her permission, to a diner that was open. A place I knew that was warm and lit, and staffed by a woman named Rosie who had been there every time I'd ever gone in, and who had the quality of someone who does not require a reason for you to be there. I walked in with her and sat across the table from her for an hour and 40 minutes, which was the longest I'd been off the road in a single stretch in months. And we drank coffee and she talked and I listened, which is the only thing I know how to do with any consistency. I don't know what happened after she left. I don't know if it mattered. I don't know if what I perceived was accurate or if I projected the whole thing from some residual shape in my own mind. I drove away at 4:20 a.m. and I did not review the footage. The camera's in my car. It's running right now, probably. Recording whoever is sitting in the back seat and the road ahead, and the ordinary continuous fact of the city moving past. It's very good at what it does. It records light with complete fidelity. It will confirm or deny the physical facts of everything that happens in its frame. It will not confirm what I feel in a car. It will not record the remove when I feel it. It will not tell me whether the thing I'm perceiving is real or constructed, whether I am reading people correctly or building patterns from my own damage. Whether the decision to say something is courage or catastrophe, that's not what cameras are for. The blank paper is still in the glove compartment. I haven't thrown it out, and I don't think I'm going to. It sits there folded in its deliberate square, among the receipts and the insurance card and the parking permit, and on certain nights when the city is quiet and the rides have slowed and I'm parked somewhere with the engine idling, I think about Nadia in the back seat, and the 51 seconds of footage that doesn't have her in it. And I think about what it means that two different kinds of record can look at the same event and come back with different answers. And then I get a ping, and I drive.